If it were up to me, I wouldn't let someone like that serve food. The man scoffed loud enough for the whole diner to hear. The room went still. The waitress stood frozen near the coffee station, face half turned, the scar that curved from ear to jaw, suddenly all anyone could see. No one said a word. No one looked her in the eyes. But then, a chair scraped, and slowly, deliberately, a teenage boy in a sharp cadet uniform stood up. His mother whispered something, trying to stop him. He didn't move. With his hands clenched and jaw set, the boy walked across the room and stopped beside the man's table. Everyone stared. The boy's voice was steady as he spoke. That scar represents honor. You only have a mouth. And just like that, the silence broke. Benny's Corner Cafe sat at the edge of a sleepy road in rural Kentucky, nestled between a worn-out gas station and a bait shop that hadn't updated its sign since 1994. The kind of place where the coffee was always hot, the jukebox always slightly out of tune, and the regulars didn't need menus. The bell above the front door chimed with every entry, and everyone knew each other's names, except for the ones just passing through. Behind the counter, Clara Hill 48 moved with practiced efficiency. She wore a faded blue apron, a silver name tag, and a scar that ran from the corner of her left eye down to her chin. Most folks didn't mention it. The regulars had learned either by instinct or decency that you didn't ask. You just thanked her when she brought your pie and maybe left a generous tip. But the scar told a story whether people asked or not. 16 years ago, Clara had been a field medic during Operation Enduring Freedom. She didn't talk about what happened in Kandahar, but those who knew her, really knew her, understood that the scar wasn't from some accident. It was earned under fire. She had been stabilizing a young private whose leg had been shattered by an IED when the second mortar struck. Clara took shrapnel to the face, the force slamming her into the side of the medical Humvee. The boy survived. She never found out his name. After 3 surgeries and a medical discharge, she returned home not to applause or ceremony, but to silence, to a stack of VA paperwork, aching joints, and a kitchen job she'd never wanted. Now she worked 6 days a week at Benny's, serving pancakes instead of plasma. The lunch crowd that day was typical. Truckers sat at the counter flipping through newspapers. A retired couple near the window split a grilled cheese. The rhythm was familiar. Take the order, fill the coffee, smile, repeat. Clara found comfort in it, in the quiet control of it all. After the chaos of war, there was peace and predictability. Then the bell rang. They came in loud. 5 of them, 3 men, 2 women wearing designer sunglasses and overpriced jackets that practically screamed, "Not from around here." Weekend tourists from the city, probably stopping on their way to one of the lake resorts that had become trendy lately. The kind of folks who found charm in rustic diners so long as the Wi-Fi was strong and the food came with hashtags. Clara approached with her usual warmth. "Welcome to Benny's. I'll be taking care of y'all today. Can I start you with something to drink?" The man in the tailored navy blazer, he looked like he'd never held a wrench or broken a sweat, lowered his menu. His eyes locked on her face, following the scar like it was a roadmap to something unpleasant. He winced, actually winced. Then, just loud enough for the table to hear, but too loud for it to be anything but deliberate, he muttered, "Yikes. Did Halloween come early?" One of the women at the table chuckled, but it was the uncomfortable kind, more about going along than finding it funny. Clara didn't flinch. She'd learned not to. She simply said, "I'll give y'all a moment with the menus," and turned away. The man wasn't finished. "Hey," he called after, her voice raised. "I asked you a question. What happened to your face? You fall asleep on a chainsaw." The diner froze. Forks stopped midair. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The entire place held its breath. Clara stood still, her back to them. She didn't turn around, didn't dignify it. Instead, she said quietly, "I'll send another server to your table," and walked toward the kitchen. Her steps measured her shoulder square. Only her eyes betrayed the sting, and even then barely. Later, people would say they didn't know what to do, that they were too shocked, that someone else should have said something. But silence has a weight to it. It lets cruelty sit in the center of a room like a guest of honor. And Clara had carried that weight before, over sand, under fire, beside dying men who hadn't made it back. This was just another scar. Not visible maybe, but no less real. People forget that millions of veterans wear their battles every day. Not all scars show. Some hide beneath sleeves or between ribs or behind quiet smiles in diners like this one. But they're there. They're always there. Clara set the tray down in the kitchen. Her hands trembled slightly the way they used to in the early days after discharge. She focused on lining up the water glasses one by one edge to edge, steadying herself the way she had years ago, in a combat tent with a flashlight and morphine needle. Behind her, laughter drifted in again from the tourist table, and somewhere near the back of the diner, a boy in a cadet uniform had stopped eating and started watching. Clara Hill never talked about Afghanistan, not because she'd forgotten, but because she remembered too much. Sometimes when the steam from the kitchen rose just right, mixing with the clatter of plates and the sharp smell of grilled onions, it transported her back to that heat, the real kind, the kind that came off sand and fire and panic. She'd been 29 when she first deployed, a combat medic with steady hands and a knack for calming soldiers twice her size, with nothing but a firm look and a quiet voice. They used to joke that Clara could stitch a wound faster than most guys could load a rifle, and it wasn't far from the truth. The day it happened, they'd been ambushed near a supply route outside Paktika province. A convoy had taken a hit, 3 men down. Clara sprinted toward the smoking Humvee without hesitation, her medical bag bouncing at her side. Gunfire popped in the distance, but her world had narrowed to those wounded men. One had a tourniquet on, but was still losing blood fast. The other had burns. The third, just a kid, maybe 19, wasn't moving. Clara dragged them one by one to cover, applied pressure, called for evac. When the mortar came, it didn't whistle like in the movies. It slammed hard, sudden, ruthless. She never saw the metal fragment that cut her face, just the blood, and then the pain, and then the silence. 3 soldiers lived because of her that day. No medals followed, no ceremonies, just recovery rooms and forms, and a long flight back to the States where no one met her at the airport. The VA called it non-life-threatening trauma. She called it a second birthday, but what followed was far harder than the shrapnel. Clara's discharge papers came with a mountain of red tape. Appointments were delayed. Disability benefits were under review. The scar on her face healed faster than the paper cuts from government forms. For a while, she lived out of her pickup truck, slept under overpasses, brushed her teeth at gas stations. A local church offered hot meals a few nights a week, and she took them without pride, without complaint. People looked at her sideways, a woman alone with a soldier's posture and a hollow look. They didn't ask if she had served. They just assumed she'd made bad choices. That's how it goes sometimes. But eventually things turned. Benny's Corner Cafe wasn't hiring when Clara walked in, but the owner, Ben Strickland, had seen the look in her eyes. A Vietnam veteran himself, he recognized it, the distance, the exhaustion, the fight still flickering beneath the surface. He didn't ask about her scar. He didn't need to. "I can pay cash until we get the paperwork done," he said. "You know your way around a kitchen?" "Yes, sir," Clara had replied. "You say 'sir' one more time and I'll make you clean the fryer," he joked. She smiled for the first time in weeks. Ben was old school. He didn't talk much about Vietnam, just said he'd been in the bad parts. But he watched Clara like a hawk those first few weeks, not because he didn't trust her, but because he understood her silence. He saw how she flinched at loud noises, how she scanned every room she entered, how she couldn't quite relax even when pouring coffee. Eventually he stopped watching, not because she changed, but because she showed up every day, early, reliable, calm. Benny's ran better with her in it, and the customers, they got used to the scar, or at least learned to stop staring. Small towns are funny that way. They'll wave at you from the porch, ask about your dog, your kids, your garden, but they rarely ask about the things that matter most. They knew Clara was a veteran, knew she'd been hurt, but that was as far as they went. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know how to care. They didn't know what to say, so they said nothing at all. But Clara never needed the fanfare. What she wanted was simpler peace, routine dignity. She found that in Benny stacking syrup bottles, flipping coffee filters, wiping down booths, there was something sacred in the small things. After the chaos of war, repetition became her therapy. Still, the ache never fully left. Not just the physical pain in her knee or the occasional throb in her jaw when the weather changed, but the ache of being forgotten, of knowing she gave everything she had and came back to a world too distracted to notice. Heroes aren't always welcomed home. not with banners or parades. Sometimes they're handed aprons and told to smile through the shift. And they do, because that's what service looks like, even off the battlefield. That afternoon, Clara had simply wanted to get through lunch. No drama, no scenes, just table numbers and refills. But cruelty has a way of finding the quiet ones. And somewhere behind her, as she tried to steady her breath in the kitchen, she could feel it, the weight of the room shifting. The man who had mocked her was still laughing, but someone had noticed. A boy in a cadet uniform, a boy who had seen everything and hadn't looked away. From the far end of Benny's Corner Cafe, Jacob Myers hadn't taken a single bite of his meal. His grilled cheese had gone cold, his glass of sweet tea untouched. His hand sat still in his lap, but his eyes, sharp, dark, and steady, were locked on the table near the center of the diner. He hadn't looked away since the man in the navy blazer made the first cruel remark. At 16, Jacob was tall and lean, all elbows and knees still growing into themselves. His uniform crisp gray, with deep blue trim and a brass pin just below the collar, marked him as a cadet at Riverside Military Academy, one of the more prestigious prep schools in the state. It was an honor to wear it, but today it felt heavy. He hadn't expected much from a pit stop in a small-town diner. Just a quiet lunch with his mom on their drive home from visiting his late father's memorial in Lexington. But then that man opened his mouth, and no one did anything. Not one voice spoke up. Not one adult corrected him. Jacob had always believed that grown-ups were supposed to lead. That's what his instructors taught: follow, honor, lead, with courage. Yet here in real life, everyone froze. Even the ones who looked like veterans with the ball caps and military decals on their jackets, they stayed silent. Eyes averted, forks pushed food in circles. It made his stomach twist. Across the table, his mother Laura glanced at him with concern. She knew that look in her son's eyes. His jaw was clenched tight, the muscle twitching just beneath the surface. His right hand flexed slightly as if reaching for something invisible. "Jacob," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't." She didn't deserve that, he replied, eyes still forward. "I know, honey, but this isn't our fight." "That's the problem," he muttered. "It's never anyone's fight until someone makes it theirs." Laura sighed. She wasn't angry, just worried. It had only been 2 years since her husband, Captain Michael Myers, had died overseas. A roadside bomb outside Herat. She remembered the knock at the door, the folded flag, the way Jacob hadn't cried but hadn't spoken for 3 days either. Since then, Jacob had changed. He'd thrown himself into the academy with a kind of discipline that even his instructors found rare. He didn't talk about his dad much, but he wore his old dog tags beneath his shirt every day. And he noticed things, especially when someone disrespected the uniform or those who wore it. From their booth, Jacob had watched every second of what happened to the waitress. He saw the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her hand trembled just slightly as she carried the tray to the kitchen. He watched the mockery roll off the man's tongue like it meant nothing, like she meant nothing, like the scar on her face was something to laugh at instead of salute. Jacob didn't know her name yet, but he knew her story, not the specifics but the truth beneath it. He'd seen it on the walls of the base his dad used to bring him to. He'd seen it in the VA waiting rooms, in the eyes of men who'd come home walking differently, speaking less. He saw it in the photographs he still kept in a shoebox under his bed. Service left marks. Some you could see, most you couldn't. But they were all real. He reached up and touched the brass pin on his chest, a small eagle etched into a circular seal. He'd earned it last semester for leading a search and rescue drill under pressure. It was a proud moment. His mother had cried when they pinned it on, but today it felt like a badge without meaning, because real leadership wasn't in drills or ceremonies. It was in moments like this. Jacob's fork scraped against his plate as he pushed it aside. His mom looked up sharply. "Jacob, wait." He was already standing. At the center of the diner, the man in the blazer was still chuckling with his companions. Their laughter was thinner now, awkward, fading, but no less cruel. The waitress hadn't come back to their table. Another woman, older, was now nervously taking their order. But Jacob's attention wasn't on them anymore. It was on her. She was near the coffee station, organizing mugs in silence, pretending not to hear the whispers that still lingered in the room like smoke. Her posture was straight, proud, but the fatigue in her shoulders was impossible to miss. So was the strength. Jacob exhaled. His father used to say, "Courage doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it walks in quietly and refuses to sit down." Today that voice echoed in Jacob's ears louder than ever. He took a step forward, then another. In that moment, the air in Benny's cafe began to change. Not because someone shouted, not because fists were raised, but because one boy stood up and decided he wouldn't sit back down. The sound of Jacob's shoes on the diner floor was barely louder than the hum of the overhead lights, but it might as well have been a drum roll. He walked with quiet precision, each step measured. At the table near the window, the man in the navy blazer, still riding the high of his cruel performance, glanced up. He wasn't expecting confrontation, especially not from a teenage boy in uniform. "Well, look at this," the man smirked, nudging one of his companions. "We got ourselves a junior G.I. Joe." Jacob didn't flinch. He stopped directly beside the table spine, straight hands at his sides, parade rest, just as he'd been taught. The diner went still again. Forks paused. Conversations died. Even Clara, standing by the coffee station, turned and looked up, confused at first, then frozen, as recognition dawned. Jacob's voice was calm but carried through the room like it had been waiting to be heard. "That scar," he said, nodding gently toward Clara, "represents honor." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You," he continued, eyes locked on the man, "only have a mouth." A low gasp rippled through the room. Somewhere near the counter, a spoon clinked softly against a ceramic mug. The man's smirk faded. "Listen, kid," he began, sitting up straighter. "This is adult business. Why don't you go back to your PlayStation and let the grown-ups, no Jacob, cut in? I know exactly what this is. It's cowardice dressed up as confidence." Now the whole diner was watching, not just out of curiosity, but out of something deeper. It was as if Jacob had said the words everyone else had been too afraid to. He gestured again toward Clara. "She didn't ask for your opinion. She didn't ask to be stared at or laughed at. She served her country, risked her life, saved people." The man scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Oh, please, you don't even know her." "I don't have to," Jacob replied. "I know her type. My dad was one, and he taught me to spot courage when I see it." At the word dad, Jacob's mother looked down, hands trembling slightly in her lap. "She carries her scars in the open," Jacob said, turning his voice to the rest of the room. "Now, not just the man. Most people hide theirs. Behind suits, behind money, behind ugly words that make them feel bigger." A beat of silence. Then from the counter, the gruff voice of a truck driver. "He's right." The man stood slowly, turning on his stool to face them all. "My daughter did 2 tours in Afghanistan, came back with burns on her face and PTSD no one wanted to understand. That waitress," he nodded toward Clara. "She's braver than half the people I've ever met." Across the diner, heads began to nod. A middle-aged woman near the jukebox added, "I was a nurse at Walter Reed. The things those vets lived through. That scar is a badge, not a blemish." The man in the blazer looked around and realized something terrifying. He was alone. His companions were now quiet, shifting in their seats. One of the women reached for her purse. Another man at the table muttered, "Maybe we should go." Still, the navy blazer tried to recover his swagger. It was just a joke. People are so sensitive these days. Jacob's face remained calm. "Jokes are supposed to be funny," he said. "Cruelty isn't comedy." Then he turned to Clara. For a moment, the uniform and posture fell away, and he was just a boy again. "Thank you," he said simply. Clara's throat tightened. She hadn't spoken since the moment began, but now she stepped forward slowly. Her voice was soft, steady. "What's your name?" "Jacob Myers. Riverside Military Academy, ma'am. Your father would be proud." Jacob blinked hard, holding back the emotions, now bubbling to the surface. "Thank you, ma'am. I hope so." Just then, Ben, the owner of Benny's, appeared beside the man's table, wiping his hands on a towel. "I think it's time y'all paid up," he said firmly. The man opened his mouth to protest, but Ben wasn't having it. "You've eaten enough," he said, placing the check down like it was a verdict. "Now kindly finish your business and don't come back." They left in awkward silence, tossing a few bills on the table. A tip, not of kindness, but of guilt. But it didn't matter anymore. Something had shifted in the room. The heavy silence from earlier had been replaced by something warmer. Not applause, not drama, just quiet acknowledgement. The kind that says, "We saw that." The kind that says, "Finally." As Jacob returned to his table, Clara watched him with a newfound sense of peace, something she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, the scar on her face wasn't the first thing people noticed. Today it had become something else entirely, a symbol. The lunch crowd at Benny's Corner Cafe began to thin as the afternoon sun pushed west, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. The laughter that once came at Clara's expense had long since vanished, replaced by soft conversations and the gentle clatter of dishes being cleared. But something in the room had changed, not just in volume, but in weight. People now looked at Clara differently. They didn't stare at her scar, not anymore. They met her eyes. They nodded. One woman even whispered a quiet thank you as she left, pressing a folded $10 bill into Clara's hand. Near the counter, Jacob Myers stood beside his mother, waiting to pay. His uniform was still sharp, his shoes still polished, but there was something new in the way he carried himself. A touch of gravity, like something inside him had grown in the span of one meal. Clara approached, slowly wiping her hands on a towel more out of nerves than necessity. "You heading out?" she asked, offering a small smile. "Yes, ma'am," Jacob replied, standing at attention without realizing it. "You don't have to ma'am me. Not after what you did today." He looked down, almost embarrassed. "I just said what needed to be said." Clara studied him for a moment. He reminded her of someone, a young medic she'd once trained with in Bagram. Wide-eyed, full of ideals, always the first to volunteer for danger. He hadn't made it back. "You did more than speak," she said gently. "You stood. That's not as easy as it looks." Jacob hesitated, then reached into the inside pocket of his uniform jacket. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. "I wanted to give you something," he said. He pulled out a small brass leadership pin, worn but polished, shaped like an eagle with a shield across its chest. Clara blinked. "This was awarded to me last semester," he explained, voice quiet but steady, "for leading a rescue drill during field training. They said I showed courage under pressure." She opened her mouth to object, but he held the pin out between them. "Today I realized I didn't earn this nearly as much as I thought I did." "You've been living that courage every day." Clara stared at the pin resting in his open palm. Her throat tightened. "I can't take this," she whispered. "It means something to you." "It still does," Jacob said. "But it means more to me if it's with someone who showed me what real honor looks like." She didn't reach for it right away. Instead, she looked at him not as a child, not even as a cadet, but as someone who understood more than most adults she'd met. His words weren't flattery, they were truth. Slowly, Clara reached out and accepted the pin, holding it with the same careful reverence she used to hold morphine syringes in battlefield tents. Precious, powerful, dangerous in the right hands. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a breath. Jacob nodded once. His mother, who had watched quietly from the side, wiped a tear before it could fall. "I think your father would have been proud today," Clara added, meeting his eyes. Jacob swallowed hard. "So would yours." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The diner faded behind them. The noise, the dishes, the hum of the refrigerator, all distant. Just two people connected by something deeper than circumstance. Shared service, shared sacrifice, shared silence. Then, like a soldier returning to her post, Clara straightened. She walked back to the break room, opened the small metal locker where she kept her things, and pinned the brass eagle next to her name tag, C. Hill. It didn't shine like her other service pins once did, but somehow it felt heavier, truer. As the dinner shift began, she moved through the cafe with her usual rhythm, filling coffee, wiping tables, greeting regulars. But the weight on her chest wasn't just from the pin. It was the weight of being seen again, not as a wounded woman, not as a scarred waitress, but as someone who had endured and still showed up. Outside, the Kentucky sky was turning gold, the kind of light that made old tractors and gas station signs look like paintings. And in that light, Clara caught her reflection in the diner's front window. For years, she'd looked at that face and seen only damage. But today, she saw survival. And beside her name tag, the small brass pin gleamed like it had always belonged there. Heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear aprons. Sometimes they carry trays instead of rifles. But every now and then, a uniform finds its way back to them, not on their shoulders, but in the respect of the next generation. And when that happens, even the deepest scars begin to fade. Sometimes the deepest scars aren't on our skin, they're in the way people look at us or the silence they give when they should speak up. Clara's story isn't just about one cruel man or one brave boy. It's about how we choose to treat one another. It's about seeing people really seeing them for the battles they fought, even if we weren't there to witness them. In today's world, we move fast. Too fast, maybe. We scroll, we pass, we avoid eye contact. But sometimes what a person truly needs is not pity, not applause, just recognition. A simple nod, a kind word. A young man brave enough to say, I see your sacrifice. I honor it. So here's a question worth asking. Have we forgotten how to stand up? Not just for veterans, but for decency, for quiet courage, for the ones serving us silently every day. If you've ever witnessed someone being disrespected and didn't know what to say, what should we say next time? And if you've been that person in silence, what helped you through? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done if you were in that diner? If this story moved you, please consider liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for listening, for remembering, and for honoring those who still carry the weight of service with quiet dignity. Because sometimes, the smallest voice in the room says the most important thing.